Hello, everyone. I'm with Dr. Tim Aker, Academic Director of the Margaret Thatcher Center, here to discuss your book, The First Brexiteer. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you for having me, Cole. Neil Marten, not a man that many people nowadays will remember, but 50 years ago was a household name. He was the chairman of the No campaign in the first European referendum that the United Kingdom had in 1975. More importantly, he was also the parliamentary organiser for the rebellion going into what was then known as the Common Market. He led 15 Conservative and Unionist MPs into the No lobby on the 17th of February 1972 against a government confidence measure. Simply put, they were willing to bring down the government to stop Britain going into the European Economic Community. And since then, we have not seen that level of parliamentary opposition to a government that put a confidence measure forward. In Maastricht, there was opposition, but the rebels held back when John Major put it to a confidence vote. In 1972, they were perfectly willing to bring down the government to stop Britain going into the common market.
Yeah, and I think that also lays the foundation for many conservative rebellions today, and I think you see it in today's conservative with the fall of Sunak and the early conservative government from 2020 to 2024, sort of in the voting out of last July 2024. I think that rebellion in 17 through 74, I believe, and sort of with the referendum to stay in the EEC in 75, played a big part in what we're going to discuss today. So I think a good question I have to start would be, Marten's central argument against the EEC was a lot about parliamentary sovereignty. So if you could just speak on that a little bit and sort of we can see where the conversation goes from there.
Yeah, so Neil Marten believed that Parliament was sovereign, and Marten was a believer in the independence of the United Kingdom. He was a soldier, very distinguished war record. He was a member of the SOE. He trained French resistance. He trained the Norwegian resistance. After the war, he was in MI6. And the family have tried to get his file from government to find out exactly what he did. And both Boris Johnson and William Hague, when they were foreign secretaries, said that, well, hang on, your father would understand that we cannot tell you. But what we do know is that he operated behind the Iron Curtain. He got people out of the Soviet Union, its satellite states. One in the book is Andrzej Panufnik, famous composer, musician, who married Neil's secretary, Camilla Jessel. So he was a soldier, he was a patriot, and believed that the United Kingdom should be sovereign and independent. And it's interesting that after Britain votes to stay in the common market in 75, he revels in the beauty of a hung parliament where parliament is able to defeat the executive.
Yeah.
And I might add there, without the executive, the government, having to resign.
Yeah.
And it goes back to all the way back to 1970 when Ted Heath said on the 5th of May 1970 in the Chambers of Commerce in Paris that Britain needed the full-hearted consent of parliaments and peoples before going in. And in the parliamentary battles over accession, it never showed it. It never showed it in terms of bringing down the guillotine, which meant that parliamentary discussion was limited. The fact that the accession treaty only passed by a majority of 8. That wasn't full-hearted consent. And the fact that there was no referendum.
Yeah, and it was passed by an affirmative resolution rather than having sort of individual layers to sort of pick out what was right and pick out what was wrong. It just sort of passed altogether.
Oh, it couldn't be amended.
Yeah.
There was a funny episode there where there was an amendment that passed by 4 votes. And Marten picks up on this. And the 4-vote majority was the slimmest margin that the government won with throughout the whole debate in 1972. And it's funny that it wasn't because of a controversial measure. I think it was some measure on agriculture. It wasn't because of debate and persuasion. It was purely because a party hosted by Duncan Sands, who was a pro-marketeer conservative, overran. There was traffic lots of MPs were late getting back for the vote. So it wasn't anything to do
Yeah.
with the debate or argument.
Yeah.
But Neil says in the diaries that from that point they just needed to amend it once. They just needed to amend it once. And we now learn that there was a group of Labour MPs who were going to stand down at the subsequent election.
Yeah.
And they regulated their abstentions so that it wouldn't be amended. So we now know that there was intense parliamentary wrangling behind the scenes for it. But what a time to have been there.
What a
to
time.
see every vote, the whips watching every vote. And where every vote, as Ted Heath said in the second reading debate, that could have brought down the government.
Yeah, the backbenchers as well. Everyone played a real role in it.
Yeah.
And so I guess moving on, Neil Marten also with the Commonwealth. He had a big role of wanting to sort of the impact of the EEC entry on the Commonwealth, sort of with, he mentioned sugar, he mentions New Zealand, and I know Enoch Powell, which we'll get to him, his speech on Pakistan and how they're not up my street at all, and how Marten was kind of separate from that. So he notes Powell's view that Pakistan leaves the Commonwealth and sort of what unravels from that. So would you want to talk about a little bit about his view?
Well,
and sort
Neil
of
Marten was a very big Commonwealth guy.
Yeah.
He loved the Commonwealth. He thought the Commonwealth was where Britain's influence was greatest, where Britain's interests lie, and that by going into the common market, we were throwing away our ties. He talks about Commonwealth trade preferences, the old imperial preference, that we had preferable trading links, that because of the common external tariff of the European Union, that was going to destroy the trade. And he talks about sugar and the damage to New Zealand.
Yep.
And he just saw it as completely unnecessary, and that we were turning our backs on our kith and kin within the Commonwealth. His friendship with Enoch Powell is a complicated exercise, because we read in the diaries that he wasn't a Powellite in terms of immigration, but was completely entranced with Enoch Powell on Europe. And it's funny that Powell never really had a group that he tied himself to in the Conservative Party. The Monday Club were desperate for him to lead them.
Yeah,
they were desperate. I think it was at the conference in, I think it was 1968 or 1969. They had Powell for Premier badges, and he just ignored them.
Yeah,
it's quite unbelievable. He just ignored them. He wouldn't be tied to any faction or any grouping, because he wanted to lead the Conservative Party. He didn't want to lead any faction. He wanted to lead the Conservatives. And Marten became a close friend with Enoch Powell. Powell only had, I think, a handful of close allies, John Biffin being one of the others. And it's interesting that Marten was one of the few people that Powell confided in early 1974, where he said he wasn't going to stand again.
No.
Wasn't going to stand again. So, yeah, it's interesting, and history is full of what-ifs, and a historian treads on very dodgy ground when they get into this argument over, what if. But, what if Powell could have led the Conservative Party after Heath fell? Neil goes into sort of convoluted route in some of his entries about how Powell could have come back after 1974 and led the Conservative Party, which is, we can look back now and say it's pure daydreaming. I mean, Powell got up in 74 and said, vote Labour. Yeah. But that didn't affect Powell's relationship with Neil Marten.
No.
It's quite fascinating. And one of the titles I was looking at when putting these diaries together, the First Brexiteer jumped out because of how central Neil was to everything. But the second title I thought of was Labour's Tory.
That's a good
because
title.
Of how he got on well with Labour MPs.
Yeah.
His relationship with Jack Ashley over rights for the disabled. He's invited to the funeral for John Mendelsohn, and the only Tory there because of how they cooperated over the European issue. He was a real cross-party man, and put the country before party.
Yeah. And I know you mentioned the Monday Club. There's also a construction of the Suez Club. There's many different sort of factions within the Conservative Party. There's a lot of present day, contemporary studies that will sort of overlook this conservative rebellion during the 70s, early 70s, and say that they suggested that there was peaceful unity between the Conservatives. Studies by Baker, there's different scholars that sort of suggest that. What would you have to say to that, and why would they have come to that conclusion about there being sort of this peaceful unity? Have they not really looked into the matter, even though this was a clear ground-laying blueprint for sort of the fall of the Conservative Party in 2024 July?
Peaceful unity is applicable when you look at the votes in Parliament. So we look at the Heath years, which were traumatic for the Conservative Party. They explain Margaret Thatcher's ascent to power. In the divisions on prices and incomes policy, which was very controversial, the bailing out of Rolls-Royce, when John Davies, the industry minister, had said they weren't going to bail out lame ducks.
Nope.
And yet they did it for Rolls-Royce. They did it for Upper Clyde shipbuilders. And then you have the Industry Act in 1972, which gives a blank check to all industry. There were virtually no parliamentary rebellions. But if you look through the archive material, you can see a lot of concern, and particularly Neil Marten's concerns. And it's interesting how he explains time and again how each one of the U-turns is a complete betrayal of the Conservative manifesto. And that by the end, he says that the Conservatives and Labour are indistinguishable, and references cartoons that show Edward Heath in the trademark Harold Wilson Ganex Mac. But what kept the Conservatives together was the fear of Wilson returning, and particularly when we look at the constituency trouble that Neil Marten had, where his association threatened to deselect him over the issue. They saw marketeers as being, the anti-marketeers as being proxies for Harold Wilson, and they thought, no, we're not going to have this anymore. We will even try and deselect you. So there was a lot of pressure that he came over. And of course, you've got where he votes against the Immigration Act, and he's kicked off the Board of Security. Incredible.
And sort of Wilson's return, Heath going into that election was "Who governs Britain?" That was his slogan that he ran on. So what would you say about that slogan sort of stemming from this earlier Conservative rebellion?
Well, the answer was not you. And this is what creates Thatcherism, is that Edward Heath who picks a fight with the mine workers in the winter?
And then met their wages at increase in 27%.
And then he gave in. He gave in 1972. They lost in 1974. And in essence, Thatcherism is a response to the failures of Heath. And some scholars have said that the manifesto of 1970 was the first Thatcherite manifesto. And Thatcherism is learning from the mistakes of Edward Heath with the resolve and courage that Heath never had. But I'd like your views on this, Cole. One view is that Heath decided to throw everything out because he wanted to spend in industry, increase exports, ready for EEC membership, that Heath was willing to risk everything, including his own government, in order to get Britain into Europe. What do you see from that?
I see the same thing as you. I see a big stretch by Heath to sort of, he knows he kind of screwed up with the nationalization of the Rolls-Royce industry, sort of all these lame duck policies that he went back on, even though in that Paris speech on September 5th, 1970, he said that he would require the full-hearted consent of Parliament. Yet he never was able to fulfill any campaign promises. So after a few years of not fulfilling any campaign promises, it's almost like he kind of went into this where if he was on the ship, he would have taken the whole ship down with him. And sort of that's essentially what he's done.
However, it's going to be a very rare instance, this. I'm going to play devil's advocate for Edward Heath.
Right.
So you're Prime Minister. And Heath's history and background is very important here, because his political years, formation of his political views in the early 30s, mass unemployment, saw the war and the damage a divided Europe did. He's in power, and within the space of a few weeks, he has what some historians have called a dilemma. So early 1972, unemployment passes the symbolic figure of 1 million. Bloody Sunday in Northern Ireland, a terrible catastrophe. His one totemic policy, Europe integration, hangs by a thread at the second reading, and he's saved by Liberal votes. The economy is overheating, inflation is rising, Britain's balance of payments isn't where it should be. He needs to get the country ready for EC membership, so he turns the taps on. It is a gamble, but do you think it was a reasonable gamble when you put yourself in Edward Heath's shoes?
I think it was a reasonable gamble to sort of make your mark in history and to sort of leave your footprinting. It seemed like a lot went against him. There was a lot of domestic issues that sort of left him unwavering and unable to fulfill his campaign promises. And I think the catastrophe of Bloody Sunday in Northern Ireland, you have sort of all this lame duck policy that's kind of going on at the same time. I do think it was a gamble taken not only for his political remembrance, but also to sort of leave his mark in history, whether for the good or for the bad.
Yeah, and that's what every Conservative MP saw.
Yeah,
they most of them had seen the early unemployment of the Depression. They'd seen the troubles of the Second World War. They saw that they were all going along with the overriding policy of being full employment in the economy. And yet all of this was being tested in this short period of time.
Yeah.
And what bound them all together was a complete hatred of Harold Wilson.
Yeah.
They saw him as shifty, they saw him as unreliable, and of course Neil was the one that asked him the most parliamentary questions. And I think there was a grudging respect there.
Yeah.
I don't think Neil appreciated Harold Wilson's, shifty behaviour on Europe or on politics in general. But there was there was a respect, and of course, they actually got on.
Yeah.
He wished him well, and then Wilson gave him a bottle of wine. If you're ever in the pub in Minster Lavelle, you can have the bottle of Burgundy on him. There was a good rapport there. But isn't it funny that you had politicians that were on the other side of the aisle that could actually get on and didn't wish each other harm? They could agree to disagree. How far is that removed from now?
Yeah, that doesn't remove at all. And
no.
Not only in UK politics, but in the US politics. You can see in the John McCain and Obama election of 2008, them shaking hands at sort of all the debates they had. And then in 2024 and just 2020 and 2016, Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump, they're making jokes about how one should be in jail and because of all the emails of Hillary Clinton. Everything going on, the political polarization has definitely taken that next step.
Yeah, there's a very interesting piece in there where Dennis Skinner, an MP who lost in 2019, he served all the way through. He goes on the television and he's very anti-conservative man, Dennis Skinner, very anti-conservative. But he's asked by the presenter a politician he admires. And he says Neil Marten. Because he suffered for what he believed in.
Yeah.
And when you look at, a politician has the national picture to respect, but also has one eye on their constituency party.
Yeah.
And the Conservative Party always had a reputation for loyalty.
Yeah.
They were the loyal ones. They were united. There were no divisions. Labour were the ones that were at each other's throats. And I think the early 80s have a big role to play in that. The automatic reselection, the splits with the SDP. But the Conservative Party was a lot more fractured than historians and people realise. And it all goes back to the common market on this.
Yep.
There was one MP, Ronald Bell, in Buckinghamshire, who was deselected. They tried a deselection because of his stance on Europe. And it was a farcical process where he came close to losing twice. In fact, he did lose once. But his association said that the vote was non-binding. How different it would have been. And of course, Ronald Bell is important.
Yeah.
Because he dies in 1982, and the by-election in Beaconsfield, the Labour candidate was Tony Blair. How different the world might have been.
Yeah,
How different the world might have been. Funny old world, isn't it?
It is.
But he was nearly deselected. In the Neil Marten papers, I found a letter from David Mudd, who was the MP for Camborne.
Yeah.
He voted against the principle of going into the common market in 1971. And his association, much like Martin's, were deeply unimpressed with this and gave him grief. And David Mudd said, well, if you carry on with this, I'm paraphrasing, he said, if you carry on with this, I will call a by-election.
Yeah.
And you'll be stuffed.
And
he wrote to Marten and said it worked. And so Marten tried it. And in the diaries, he says, well, if you push me too far, I'll call a by-election.
Yeah.
And I genuinely think, had he stood as an anti-market, independent Conservative, which would have been a three-way race, I think he would have pulled it off. Yeah. He had a lot of support in his constituency, and a lot of grassroots opinion for him. He references a lot of opinion polls that showed if the Conservative Party had been anti-market, and if they would have got a lot more votes in the constituency. But again, we're treading into the what ifs of history.
Yeah. So going back to what you said, sort of like how the loosely constructedness of the Conservative Party and how it was more fractured than people thought. Do you think, would you attribute a part of that to Enoch Powell's sort of role as like, was he almost indirectly a sort of a unifier of the Conservative Party? And I say this because we mentioned the Rivers of Blood speech in the 70s, where sort of the whole Commonwealth argument. And then you also have David Wood noted that Powell's speeches had brought new converts to the fold. Would you say that even though that Neil Marten wanted to recruit him and he didn't really give into it, would you say that he was an indirect unifier of the Conservative Party?
He was the equivalent of throwing a stick of dynamite into a pond. Powell was, between 1968 and 1970, one of the most disruptive influences in the Conservative Party. We've got to remember, in 1967, he votes for entry.
And then he switches.
But there is a wonderful reference from Richard Crossman in the biography of Harold Wilson by, I think, Philip Ziegler. And he says in 1967, de Gaulle will save us from our folly, which means that they could all vote for it.
Yeah.
Because they know de Gaulle's going to veto it, which he inevitably did. But in 1969, at a speech in Clacton, no less. What a history Clacton has got in Eurosceptic politics. But in Clacton, Powell says that he's basically turned against it.
Yeah.
He said, we can't do this. And historians have debated over whether this was opportunism or such. But Powell had a following in the country from his Rivers of Blood speech, which Marten was not wholly for, because he loved the Commonwealth. He'd served with Commonwealth soldiers. He was not Powellite on immigration. He was conservative on immigration. He believed there should be limits, and he had concern about the immigration after Idi Amin had expelled the Asians from Uganda. But he wasn't of a Powellite nature on it.
Yeah.
And his relationship with Powell was, I think, limited to Europe, obviously, but also Powell's analysis of the economy. I wouldn't say Neil Marten was an ideological monetarist in the sense that Powell was, but he does acknowledge that the Heath administration was overheating the economy. They were printing too much money, that the money supply was growing far too fast, far too quickly, and that, the country would overheat. And he was proved right on that. And you can see the warnings in the diaries. And he said, this is going to lead to disaster. We're going to end up with inflation running through the roof, and there'll be pressure for an incomes policy, which is exactly what happened.
Yeah. And I think Powell, what's interesting is that not a lot of people know, Powell himself, in a letter to Colin Welch, said that his view on supporting the EEC entry for the economic and defense policy itself, it was not necessarily an indication of his support for EEC membership. It was sort of more of this support for this one Europe, like the 1964 pamphlet that sort of came out, but it was not necessarily bound to him endorsing the coalition.
One Europe is a very complicated document.
It is.
Of course, hindsight gives us 2020 vision, but its chief editor, Nicholas Ridley, massive pro-European at the start, but at the end of his career in the Thatcher years, turns against it because he's fired for, or he resigns from the cabinet after intemperate remarks about German influence in Europe. How times have changed in that. But of course, there's Powell's ambition. Powell wanted to lead the Conservative Party, and he was, some historians argue that there was an element where he was always manoeuvring. And so some can argue that his approach to European unity and European defence was a way he weaseled out of his pro-Europeanism. But also Powell believed after India had independence that British assets to the east were worthless. He leaves the Suez Group. It's just pointless, absolutely pointless. When Suez is gone, that's it. It's pointless. So there is some level of consistency there, but he is a very complicated and complex character, and I encourage everyone to read Simon Heffer's biography of Enoch Powell. It is fantastic, and it lets you into the complexities of one of the intellectual greats of modern British politics, whether you agree with him or not.
Yeah.
And to see, and again, what we get from the diaries is the relationship that Marten had with actual political titans. Tony Benn. We don't understand it now, but Tony Benn was the bogeyman of the 1970s. He was regularly portrayed as a communist, as an agent of the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
When you look at, this was only a few years after the Soviet Union sent tanks into Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
We're not talking about an abstraction here. We're talking about an actual military threat.
Yeah.
And the beast that was baring its teeth. The hatred for him, the hatred for Powell. And the reason why I call Marten the first Brexiteer is because of the importance he had chairing the No campaign in 1975 and being the figurehead of the Eurosceptic, even though it wasn't called that then, but we know it as Eurosceptic. The Eurosceptic movement is because he was the glue that held it together.
Yeah.
Had Enoch Powell chaired the 70 campaign, well, he wouldn't have, because he didn't want to be tied down to anything. Had Tony Benn done it, you could imagine, well, how different that would have been for Conservative politics. It would have been completely different, because there would be no real Conservative affiliation with the anti-market cause, because of how vilified Tony Benn was in the media and in the country. So I think we've got a lot to, as Eurosceptics, a lot to owe Neil Marten.
Yeah.
And in some ways, these diaries are a tribute to the role he had, and to reintroduce him, because a lot of people now say, well, Neil who? But he recounts in the diaries the number of media interviews he had, how he was in the press very regularly.
Yeah.
And this is a tribute to his role and his influence in British politics and British history. Because without him, where would the Bruges Group be? Where would the Eurosceptics be?
Yeah.
Where would we have been in 2016?
Yeah. After reading like the papers of Peter Thomas and sort of Neil Marten, there's a quote that really stuck with me. It was sort of revealing Marten's significant role in it, and it was he was whipping up anti-market protest within the Conservative Parliamentary Party, and the fact that he ran out of patience with the government and existing anti-market groups and sought to reform a more rebellious anti-market group. And he really was that role model for the Conservative Party and for anti-central market and anti-EEC. He was the role model who had that initiative to drive an act, and that is what Enoch Powell lacked all along.
Neil Marten, I mean, rebellion, we take it for granted now when we study modern politics, how easy it is for people in Parliament to vote against the whip.
Yeah.
The generation of Marten's time were very loyal people. A lot of them had served. The fraternity and solidarity, the idea of being part of a team and a club and going in the direction. Rebelling was always the last straw.
Yeah.
And a lot of the time, rebelling meant abstention. It took a lot to vote against the whip.
Oh, yeah.
It took a hell of a lot to vote against a three-line whip. To vote against a three-line whip that was conveyed as a confidence measure was the last straw.
Yeah.
And the fact that somebody like Neil Marten, who had not only been a soldier, but also had been a spy, in his second speech in Parliament, he gets up there and says, I was a spy. National headlines.
Yeah.
For somebody like that to do it, it was a big thing. And that the recognition that they could lose their political career overnight. I mean, he turns down office.
Yeah.
Ted Heath phones him up after the 1970 election and says, I want you to come and serve in government. But the Europe thing will be a problem. Marten says, I don't think that would be such a good idea. But what if? What if?
Back to the what ifs.
Well, then this is the thing. So Margaret Thatcher appoints Neil to the government in 1979.
Yeah.
And this is after he organises a rebellion to maintain sanctions against Rhodesia.
Yeah.
That was a masterstroke. because it gave him a role in the Foreign Office. He knew Margaret Thatcher was with him on Europe policy.
Yeah.
He regularly briefs her. He's convinced she believes in the Europe of nations and not a federal union.
Oh, yeah.
And for her to bring him in the government was a masterstroke because it got him out of the backbenches where he could organise and be a nuisance, and it brought him in the government. And that just shows you how superior a politician Margaret Thatcher was to Edward Heath.
Yeah. And Powell, citing Colin Welch's letter of Europe and how it was rarely ever intended in its only precise sense, which is the geographical area, it speaks a lot to sort of what Thatcher and what you were saying with sort of laying that ground. Powell laid the groundwork for Thatcher and sort of that collaboration between Neil Marten and Thatcher in the late
years. You don't get Thatcherism without Powellism.
Yeah.
On monetarism, his analysis of money supply dictating inflation and control of the money supply being essential to monetary policy, that you just don't get it. He made those arguments even before his big stand was in 1958 when he, the Chancellor, and Nigel Birch, the other member of the Treasury team, all resign over £50 million of extra spending. That's the essence of Thatcherism, but it's on Europe that Mrs. Thatcher, with Marten, she listens to him. She brings him in. He briefs her. Marten recognises that she is completely boxed in. The Conservative Party is the pro-European party. They don't want to reopen the wounds. He recognises this and tells her not to press the issue. And there's the back and forth and the exchanges between the two of them where they agree that they don't both want a federal Europe, which she says at Bruges in 1988. It's a shame. It's heartbreaking that Neil died in 85 where he couldn't be there in 88 to actually see Mrs. Thatcher openly state what Neil had been campaigning for. But the influences of all of them, of Powell, of Marten, all that, weighed very heavy on Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah.
And you can see Thatcherism as an evolutionary process over time, and that the Thatcherites were there long before Mrs. Thatcher had ever been elected to office.
Yeah. So going back to Edward Heath and sort of his promise on the full-heartedness of everybody, he also says in June in 1970, after a speech he gave in May, where he says that Tory MPs would be free to vote in the way they decided.
Yeah.
And sort of then in January of 1971, not even, 7 months later, the publication and distribution of pro-EEC Europe and You pamphlet. That's another pamphlet we've cited, which we cited the one back in 1964, the one Europe. Sort of just this natural progression. If you could talk a little bit about it and just sort of, I'd love to discuss more.
Yeah, it's fascinating that how the government were not a neutral arbiter in all of this, and particularly the Conservative Party. So there is an ongoing back and forth between Neil Marten and Peter Thomas, the party chairman, about the rights of the party to distribute pro and anti-EEC literature. And Marten is absolutely furious about this. And we've talked a lot about how the Conservative Party were the loyal party. Yeah. They didn't factionalise. They didn't, divert and disagree with one another publicly. But this is the match to gunpowder. So Peter Thomas says to Neil Marten, "We will not be putting out anti-market
and he
materials." Yeah. And so Neil Marten goes off and says, "Well, we will form our own organisation." And you get the Conservative Anti-Common Market Information Service, which is perhaps the worst name you could give to an organisation. But it has all the hallmarks of a faction.
Yeah.
In the party conference in 1971, it has its own rally.
Yep.
It has its own office. It distributes its own materials.
Yeah.
It's been completely overlooked because it wound up, I think, in 1972.
Yeah.
But it was, in essence, and near enough, a party in a party.
It was a party within a party.
And he talks about the I think it was the division on the Labour motion in early 1972 not to ratify the bill, not to ratify the treaty until it had been produced. And Marten says it was Labour Party being political.
Yeah.
But there's wonderful entry where they just sit there on block, and he acknowledges that they could have brought down the government.
Yeah. And I think going off that, there's even the faction within a faction idea. There's an admittance to the idea from Sir Michael Fraser, the head of the research department, who says it is not the central office's job to be objective.
Yeah, I mean,
and that's just admitting that there's a faction within a faction.
Yeah, this goes on again. Partly explains the rise of Thatcher. That the Heath men were loyal to Heath, not so much the Conservative Party, and they would do whatever they could to undermine the opponents of Edward Heath.
Yeah.
And so we look at the Milk Street Mafia episode. So after the second election defeat in 1974, the 1922 committee executive, of which Marten was a member, they agreed that Heath's got to go. And Edward Buchan, the chairman, who hated Heath, and Heath hated as well.
Yeah.
He wants them to meet at his offices in the city in Milk Street. And when they turn up there, there's cameras everywhere. Somebody knows. And the passage where Neil Marten finds out how it is hilarious, but it shows that how split the party was. So Charlie Morrison, who was an MP on the executive, his wife was one of the vice chairmen of the Conservative Party, very loyal to Heath. She hears from Charlie Morrison what's happened and tells Heath.
Yeah.
And so the Heath men then brief the press, and they're out there, and they call them the Milk Street Mafia.
Yep.
Obviously, the illusions are of organised crime, that it's a mob, that it's a coup d'état, and then you get. You're right. It is a faction within a faction, and the Heath men as well. I think there's a good study of the Heath men being a faction rather than being the governing party within the party.
Yeah, and I think to add on to that, the faction within a faction, that sort of led to this domino effect that's created that and paved the road for even more factions. And you see that with the Conservative Anti-Common Market Information Service, that forming in June 29th, 1971. That was as a result of a domino effect from the admittance of it was not the central jobs office to be objective of that faction. Yeah. So it sort of really laid the groundwork for factions to be created.
Yeah, I mean, they brought it on themselves.
Yeah.
And this is a measure of Edward Heath's obstinacy, that he was not. I mean, this is odd for somebody that had been the chief whip, that how he bullied his party, that it was his way or the highway, and he was going to ride over them like a tank across the desert. And he brought it on himself. Yeah. And it played into his opponent's hands, because Eri Neve in 1975 has a very broad coalition of Conservative MPs who Edward Heath has annoyed one way or the other. And he has his coalition there to knock Heath out in the first round.
Yeah.
Which gives Margaret Thatcher the momentum.
Absolutely.
That nobody else can topple in the second round. And there's many a good essay to be written on, Heath's importance to Thatcher. You cannot get Thatcher without Heath. You cannot explain Thatcher without Heath. And the two of them would hate it. But they are both so important to one another.
Yeah, and it's funny because the relationship was and sort of just one's power to another, the trajectory of power. It was very accidental almost. It was not, or it was accidental. It wasn't a linear relationship.
You're right. So Neil Marten starts off the diaries with a respect for Heath.
Yes.
Like his relationship with Wilson and Labour MPs across the aisle, they can agree to disagree, but they are still on good terms.
Oh, like McCain and Obama, yeah.
Marten hears Heath at the 22 executive. He's very happy with what he hears. He says he gives a great speech. But then Heath turns against him.
Yeah.
And Heath's behaviour, and Heath retreats. And Marten can sense this. And his observations are the slow decline of the Conservative Party, and the dilemma that they all have. They see that the leader's going off the rails.
Off the rails.
And what do? And one thesis that you could put to this is that there is not one U-turn. It was a death by 1,000 cuts. The big U-turn is the prices and incomes policy. Yeah. They get in saying, we are not going to legislate for price and incomes policy.
Yeah.
And then they do. But you've got Rolls-Royce, Upper Clyde Shipbuilders, you've got the Industry Act.
Yeah.
Bit by bit, it's all building up so that when it's like Hemingway in bankruptcy. He says it's gradual and then
Gradual.
sudden.
Yeah.
And there they are in late 1972 thinking, oh dear,
Yeah.
we are where we are. We are running a socialist government. How did we end up here?
Yeah. And you also have the rural versus urban dilemma with just trucks, the weight of lorries. That was a big point of this.
Now you see, Neil, that's a funny thing, because after the referendum is won by the pro-marketeers, Neil Marten changes his tack to show how the EU undermines. We call it the EU now. It wasn't a common market. We've got to understand, the common market was not on ballot paper. No. It was the European Economic Community, and it was sold as trade.
Yeah.
And with a country as bad, with the economy as bad as it was, a lot of people voted for it because it was trade and wanted it to be trade. Yep. And we now know it wasn't. I think that's a crucial point.
Yeah, that is a crucial point. Get there. And I also think the understanding of the floating of the pound and the role that played, that was a big point to it as well.
It was, because they tried to harmonise the currencies afterwards.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
And Marten, it's quite amusing, the folly of trying to float the pound.
Yeah.
And then take us into an early form of exchange rate mechanism. They called it the snake in the tunnel.
Snake in the tunnel.
How appropriate, snake, a snake in the tunnel.
And then Maastricht brings the adoption of the EU.
You call it Black Wednesday, White Wednesday, because a lot of people at the time, a lot of your skeptics call it White Wednesday, because it killed any concept of the pound being pegged and going into the euro.
Yeah.
Which Greece and Cyprus and a lot of other countries that have been in the euro have seen at their cost, and at a substantial cost.
Yeah.
So we learnt the hard way. But back then, they were talking about common currency as far as 1980. In fact, when we get in, Marten recounts that in 73, Heath was talking about common currency.
Yeah.
But common market. And it's the whole shifting of the goalpost on this.
Oh my gosh.
And it was a country in flux. It was a country in crisis. It was a country of strikes. It was a country of blackouts. It was a country of, there's the passage in the diaries over when the House of Commons was nearly set alight during the electricians' strike.
Yeah.
When an MP kicks over a candle in the House of Commons.
Oh my gosh.
It's a country in crisis. And again,
burning themselves down.
When politicians are acting in the crisis, they go from one extreme to the other.
Absolutely. Yeah. As the editor of the First Brexiteer, I wanted to sort of get your insights into what was the most powerful entry that you read.
I think the most powerful one is when he's lost the referendum in 75.
Yeah.
And he handles it particularly well, knowing that the battle has changed. The war's still on, but the tactics are different.
Yeah.
And he now looks to fight a federal Europe, to expose how the pro-marketeers have completely misjudged this.
Yeah.
Of course, he notes that very few of them were actually in the debates, either out of ignorance or that they just didn't want to hear it.
Yeah.
And that it was now a case of saying to his colleagues that, look, when our minister goes to the Council of Ministers, we need to give them instructions from Parliament. Parliament has to give them instructions. Not the other way around, that them coming and telling us how it's done. Have to do it. So you've got over the heavy lorries.
Yeah, exactly.
Eviscerated meat, all sorts, all these very tiny things. But he's looking at it as a exercise as chipping away at the edifice of the common market. But the bit there where he takes it in not being a defeat, but a tactical retreat.
Yeah.
People could have expect him to say, right, this is all over, it's all over, it's all over. No, and there's a very cryptic entry where he says full-hearted consent. Is that sarcasm? Because it wasn't over half the country.
Yeah.
Was it an admission that there has now been full-hearted consent?
Yeah.
Was it sarcasm that the government, got full-hearted consent after the event? Which could that be full-hearted consent?
Yeah. And the question that brought me was that the intentions when he said that. Was that truly intentional? I do not think so.
We will never know.
But sort of after that 1975 referendum, that diary, sort of connecting that to Thatcher, the rise of Thatcher, that closing, that ending of the referendum, that was the green light for Thatcher.
Ooh, I wouldn't go that far, because she voted for it, and there's that famous picture of her with the jumper with all the flags on.
Yeah.
But she took a back seat in the referendum. There's the quote from the Charles Moore biography that had she been in the reform group of the early, if she had she not been prime minister, she'd have been in the reform group of the early 80s. And all of the meetings between Thatcher and Neil Marten now, we know that she was a lot more wary about it a lot earlier on than people have realised. And so in some ways, there is a long road to the Bruges speech in 1988.
Yeah.
And it starts with the meeting she had with Neil Marten.
Absolutely. And I think, the appointment of Neil Marten and sort of that, even Powell, bringing Powell into this, Powell and Martin's sort of their relationship set the stage for Thatcher to appoint Neil Marten and sort of have that guidance.
Where he was the bridge between the two.
He was the bridge between the two.
I hope you enjoy reading it. You can buy it on Amazon and hopefully from good bookshops.
Thank you very much for everything, and thank you for watching. And Tim, thank you for being here.
Thank you very much, Cole.